Hello and welcome. The theme for the week was understanding our anger. In the video that I put out early this week on Monday, I mentioned the misperception that we tend to carry, or that is culturally pervasive, that anger is bad. We hear that holding on to anger makes us sick. And if we take that phrase at face value, it would be easy to interpret anger equals sickness, anger equals bad. But it is one of my missions on this planet to help people not make any of their emotions wrong, bad. Anger is a perfectly healthy emotion. It's the misuse of it that gives it all that bad press. Now, back in September, I did a video on the concept of not making our emotions wrong. And as we look at anger in a new way, that's an important first step. If we can just consider that maybe these tools that are coming into us that we've been bestowed with, we were bestowed with emotions. Would we have been given anything that was meant to be perceived as bad and wrong? I don't know, that's a deeper conversation if you really go there. And I would invite you to consider for this conversation today to not make the emotion of anger wrong. Let's see what might be some other ways to look at it. Karla McLaren is going to be what I am focusing on today. Why? Because she has the most refreshing perspective on our emotions, especially the ones that might feel more challenging, darker, like anger, that I have ever heard. I have found in reading her stuff that I'm much more able to give myself permission for what I'm feeling, which helps me not get so blocked and bottled up in it that it explodes and comes out in ways that those highly emotional, unmanaged pieces give us that bad rap that, oh, emotions are bad. Well, only if we're not managing them well. And part of the first step in doing that is to not make them wrong. Any emotion has important messages to bring us. Anger specifically, as Karla McLaren shares, is valuable to help us develop our identity. That's both as an individual, and it helps us shape our identity and how we relate to others as well. Karla says that if we are never angry, we are unborn. That's an interesting thought. For those of you catching the replay, let me know what you think about that one. If we are never angry, we are unborn. What I hope that you will take away from this is to see some compassion for yourself and some compassion for the emotion of anger, and to get that little piece of awareness that will help you start to catch those pre-warning signals. If we put ourselves in the driver's seat before our emotions get to those unmanaged levels, that's using our emotions in the way that they were bestowed upon us and using them as the gift and the tool that they are. As we broaden our perspective here, it is important to consider different viewpoints than the ones that we're culturally bombarded with, where they say anger is wrong. We're hearing all of those things. I'm going to share a quote with you directly from Karla McLaren that is part of the reason that I find her so delightful. And here's the opposite refreshing perspective on anger. Karla says, anger is one of my favorite emotions because when you know how to work with it, it can help you become more authentically yourself and more able to interact authentically and honorably with others as well. Anger is a wonderful and pro-social emotion when you know how to work with it. There's Karla's take. And if you're not familiar with Karla McLaren, that may be the first time you've ever heard anger being spun in such a positive light that someone could come out and say, it's one of my favorite emotions. Here's why. The gifts that it brings. Let's talk about that. The gifts that come from anger. It creates honor. It establishes conviction. Anger brings self-awareness. It brings a healthy self-esteem, proper boundaries, which we've talked about before. Anger is huge with those boundaries. Some of those boundaries are a healthy detachment. Sometimes that's important when we need to do that. Anger comes in for protection of yourself and others. Those are all the gifts that anger brings. Now, when we know the gifts that anger offers us, we're able to take proper action in response to that signal, which is how that's supposed to go. First, not making it wrong, and then recognizing, oh, there are some positives to this, helps put us in the frame of mind to be able to use this emotion rather than it using us. There's a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio who refers to emotions as action-requiring neurological programs. Our emotions as action-requiring neurological programs. So if that were true, let's look at Karla's take on the actions that are required when anger bubbles up, when we notice even the pre-warning signs of anger. What might be some actions that need to happen in order for this to not get to an unmanageable level? Some actions could be that this anger is arising to address challenges to your standpoint. They're addressing challenges to your position, your interpersonal boundaries, or your self-image. Your task is to restore your sense of self and your interpersonal boundaries without violating the boundaries of others. Oh, wait, is there a way to do that when you're angry? Let's see. Your anger will also step in when others are being challenged or devalued, and then your task there is to address the offense and restore the boundaries of all parties. This is what Karla calls the honorable sentry. Anger as the honorable sentry, that lookout. When anger arises to protect our boundaries, we get the opportunity to reset the boundaries, which we have to do often over and over and over, especially since we'll relate to the boundary differently in different situations or as we go throughout our lives. So anger gives us that opportunity to reset our boundaries, to take a look at them again. Karla mentioned some boundary setting options. And as I'm sharing these, I would love for you guys to think, what are some boundary setting options that helps establish the boundaries without violating the boundaries of another? Just protects your own boundary. Matt says, expression of anger in protection and respect as opposed to out of control. Yes. Yes, not even with a question mark. Yes. I'm going to come back to that. Actually, there's a little piece about that and the difference in how we use anger, what's culturally shown and the ways that it's displayed, and a more conscious way to look at it. So I'm going to come back to that. Thanks, Matt. When anger arises to protect our boundaries, we get the opportunity to reset, and here are some ways. Let me know, what are some non-violent ways, some easy ways to set a boundary that doesn't violate another. One of those can be some form of laughter at the offense. So this would be if someone else is crossing our boundary. Laughter at least is alert, maybe different than how they would think we would respond. Sometimes just a raising of an eyebrow when someone crosses that line. Right? These are non-violent ways to respond. Deepening your voice. Oh, that's interesting. What was that just happened there? Even the deepening of the voice, that can set a little bit of a boundary. None of those things are overtly intense responses that our culture would label as bad. Those things that give anger a bad rap, those weren't any of them. So if we heed the emotion, it tends to soften, it tends to fade, it tends to even go away entirely for that particular situation. When the emotion is heeded, noticed, honored, and action is taken, that's when it reduces in intensity and we're not bombarded by it. Those intense emotions, they keep talking to us because they want to be heard too. They're going to keep dialing up the volume and their intensity until they're heard, acknowledged, and honored. When that need is met, that's when things seem to soften. That's what our emotions are supposed to do for us. Anger is a great one to start with because it's so passionately fiery, obvious to look at. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on some other nonviolent ways to strengthen boundaries. What are some other subtle little ways that you can say, no, don't cross that. No. Love to hear from you guys. I'm actually just about done. I'm going to do a little recap. I just wanted to get this information out there to start this discussion and reframing how we look at anger, because I don't think we're addressing it really well as a society, and absolutely recommend doing some digging with Karla McLaren because of that very refreshing perspective that she has that I find is so healthy, so embracing, so welcoming to our human side. To recap, anger, first step in dealing with it, identify it, recognize that it's anger, and allow the emotion of anger. Know also that in identifying it and allowing for it, just know in the back of your mind that emotions can travel in groups. So get really good at identifying them. This is anger and also a little bit of extra fear or some other emotions that can come up when we're triggered. I'm going to include a resource to go digging around with that of Karla's. That's amazing. The second step would be to get curious with it. Once you've identified it and you've allowed it to exist, acknowledge its presence, it has a right to be here, it's not wrong. Then getting curious and asking yourself these questions. Also from Karla. Anger is a signal that we need to ask ourselves, what must be protected? What must be protected in this situation, whatever the situation is? What must be restored in this situation? What must be restored? Now, the third step would be channeling the emotion and using it instead of letting it use us. So allowing it, figuring out what the message is, and then using it to take a positive action. Just solely expressing that anger isn't the only way to deal with those emotions as they come up. Just expressing it could come out in an explosion. But oftentimes I think that comes from us making ourselves wrong in the first place for feeling it. And that tends to escalate that emotion. That's when it can come out a little bit more explosively. That is saying if you can protect the dignity of the person you are setting boundaries with, it really facilitates understanding. Yeah. And it's such a beautiful thing that we can do for our fellow human beings. How often do you see that being done well is where I'm curious. I think we need to do so much more talking about this and educating people. I don't think it's modeled to us. I love getting people talking about this stuff because then we can practice. Because if we're not practicing, chances are we're not managing those emotions, and that's when they get to that escalated level, and then we're all kind of useless. If we can get the awareness first, practice at these easy levels, we're learning how to manage them before they get super triggery. In an ideal world, there are going to be, of course, be some situations where it gets out of our control, and then we get to be responsible adults in our integrity and come back and clean it up. And that's okay too. Channeling that emotion, using it. I mentioned just expressing it, vomiting all that intensity by just expressing the anger. It's not always the most healthy way. The idea would be that in looking at this emotion in a new way, we're able to act from a middle ground. So after I'm done recording, I am going to pop up a link to a wonderful article by Karla McLaren where she talks about how to operate from that middle ground, not from just solely expressing, only expressing our emotions or only repressing them. What is that middle ground? Fascinating article. I will pop that up in the comments. Is it unreasonable that I fear letting myself feel and express anger in the first place? I try to avoid it entirely. Yeah, that's a lot of what I mentioned at the beginning when I started recording, is that we tend to make this emotion wrong. So really, if I could do anything on this planet, it would be to help people recognize that their emotions are not wrong. What we choose to do about it, what actions we take, that's what really defines us. But our emotions, they are valuable tools. They're giving us important information to be able to inform our next steps. None of those emotions are wrong. And Matt, what you may have missed in the beginning is me referring to an earlier video I did about not making the emotions wrong. Unlabeling them is the video that I put out in September. And that's a good one to go back and peek at for those of you who are interested. So you're not alone that we tend to make our anger wrong. You're not alone. We're doing that to each other. That's kind of a cultural expectation. Can we challenge that belief? What if anger wasn't wrong? What if it had gifts? There is a difference between using anger as something that gives us strength within ourselves and using it in a way that gives us strength over somebody else. Can you all see the difference there? Anger is really about first finding that strength within, restoring something that was lost, setting that boundary. That's an internal thing. We can abuse it, misuse it by using it to put strength over someone else. That's not the right way to use it. It's done that way a lot in our culture, but that's not, I don't believe, how it's meant to be used. I'm glad you like that distinction, Matt. Thank you. In closing, I will offer a caution that if any of you are feeling like the emotion of anger or any of those more challenging emotions, sometimes any of the positive ones, that could be a conversation to be had too. Any emotions that linger, that don't have this flow of when we listen to them, we heed the messages, we take action, and then they soften or go away or are replaced by another emotion. If they're stuck, if these emotions are stuck, that's the time to check in with a doctor, with a therapist. Know that that would be totally normal, that we can all get in that place. And it's important to know that you have permission to reach out if you feel like you're stuck in it and you need an extra hand. That's what we're all here for, to boost each other up. I would love your feedback. How have you noticed anger coming up even in this week? Do you notice the subtle ways in which it comes up to set boundaries? How good are you at noticing it before it gets to those unmanaged levels? And what did you get out of this conversation? I'd love to hear from you, and have a wonderful Thursday. Bye.